The morning sun spilled pale gold across the Lazy S range as Silas McCade tightened the cinch on his saddle. His daughter Ruthie perched on the corral fence, counting the new calves. She was 7 that spring of 1884, a quiet child with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of humming tunes she made up herself. Silas had raised her alone in the small line shack at the edge of the ranch ever since consumption took his dear Eleanor 2 winters past, and though the grief still sat heavy in his chest, he had learned to carry it the way a man carried a well-worn saddle, familiar, shaping, never fully put down. The Lazy S was one of the big outfits sprawled across the Horse Creek country in Wyoming territory, owned by Boston investors who never saw the dust of a roundup. It was run by foreman Vance Harlow, a man with a voice like gravel and a talent for cutting wages while keeping his own pockets well lined. Silas had worked the range for 6 years through scorching summers and the kind of winter winds that found every crack in a cabin, and he had never once complained. He kept his head down, did his work, and counted himself lucky to have a roof and a place where Ruthie could grow up with clean air and room to run. Old Pete, the chuck wagon cook, doted on her like a grandfather, and the other hands had grown used to seeing the little girl gathering eggs or carrying firewood with grave seriousness. It was a fragile piece, the kind that depended on staying invisible. And that spring afternoon, it shattered. Ruthie had been in the henhouse collecting warm brown eggs into her apron when a sudden clatter of hooves and a splintering crash echoed from the main barn. She ran to see, as children do, and found one of the draft horses kicking wildly at its stall, the plank already broken. She backed away, frightened. But Vance Harlow appeared in the doorway with thunder in his face. He grabbed her arm too tightly and marched her to the yard where Silas was unsaddling his horse. "This girl of yours spooked my gelding," Vance barked, loud enough for every hand to hear. "Broke a stall and near crippled the animal. I told you to keep her clear of the working buildings." Silas stepped forward, his voice mild but steady. "Mr. Harlow, Ruthie was at the henhouse. She knows better than to bother the horses. That plank was already cracked. I pointed it out to you last month." Vance's eyes narrowed. He did not like being contradicted, and he especially did not like it from a soft-spoken cowhand who had once questioned his arithmetic on payday. "You're calling me a liar? I've had enough of your excuses. You're done here, McCade. Collect your gear and be off this property by sundown. And don't expect full wages. I'm docking you for the damages." Silas felt the world tilt. He opened his mouth to protest, but Vance raised a hand. "One more word and I'll send for the sheriff and have you both charged with trespass and destruction of property. You want to test me?" The other hand stood frozen. Old Pete looked at the ground, his jaw tight. Billy, the youngest cowhand, looked away. No one could afford to speak. Silas understood then that the fight was lost before it could begin. He nodded once, scooped Ruthie into his arms, and walked toward the line shack without another word. That evening, they packed the wagon. The few things they owned, Eleanor's iron skillet, still seasoned from a decade of meals, Ruthie's rag doll, patched and worn, their bedding and clothes, a small wooden box holding a tintype of Eleanor on their wedding day. Old Pete slipped them a sack of beans and salt pork, pressing it into Silas's hand with a whispered apology. Silas thanked him, his voice cracking only a little. As the wagon rattled down the dusty track away from the only home Ruthie had ever known, she sat beside him on the bench, clutching her doll. The twilight painted the hills in lavender and rose, and she asked, "Pa, why did Mr. Harlow make us leave? I didn't do nothing wrong." Silas looked at her, at the trust in her small face, and felt something hot and tight lodge in his throat. "Sometimes people aren't fair, Sugar Plum," he said, choosing each word carefully. "But I promise you, we're going to find a place where we belong, a real home. You just hold on to that." She leaned her head against his arm, and he felt her small hand slip into his. They rode on in silence, and the stars came out one by one, cold and clear over the open prairie. It was the first of the tearful moments that would mark this journey, the quiet breaking of a little girl's world and a father's resolve hardening like iron in the fire. If you're moved by Silas and Ruthie's journey so far, perhaps you know someone who needs a gentle story of hope and quiet courage. Please share it with them, and let's continue on together. They traveled 2 days toward Cheyenne, following the ruts of the old overland trail. The spring grass was green and tender, the creeks running high with snowmelt. On the second afternoon, they met a homestead family heading west, a tired-looking man and his wife with 3 children in a canvas-topped wagon. The woman, whose name was Ada, took one look at Ruthie's pale cheeks and wordlessly handed her a small carved horse made of pine, a toy her own son had outgrown. Silas tried to pay her, but Ada shook her head. "Kindness doesn't come with a price," she said. "We've been on the road long enough to know that." They shared a meal of cornbread and beans, and Ruthie laughed for the first time since leaving the ranch when the homestead boy showed her a litter of puppies under the wagon seat. That night, Silas wrote in a small journal, a habit he had kept since Eleanor's passing. "A stranger gave my girl a wooden horse today. The world is full of gifts if you keep your eyes open." It gave him strength for what he knew he must do. Cheyenne rose from the plains like a promise, its streets busy with freight wagons and cowboys on dusty horses. The Union Pacific Depot was a hive of activity. Cattle cars lined up on the tracks ready to ship beeves east. Silas left Ruthie with the kind widow who ran the boarding house on Ferguson Street, a woman named Mrs. Hatcher, who had raised 6 children of her own and missed having little feet pattering around. Then he walked to the Western Union Telegraph office, his boots heavy on the boardwalk. Inside, the clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, handed him a form and a pencil. Silas stared at the blank paper for a long moment, thinking of Eleanor, of Ruthie, of 6 years of quiet loyalty repaid with lies and cruelty. Then he wrote the message to Mr. Farnsworth, the executor in Boston who handled the estate of his late Uncle Leland Oaks, the silent majority owner of the Lazy S. Silas was the sole heir, but he had chosen to work as a common hand, wanting to know the land and its people before claiming his birthright. Now that secret would serve a different purpose. The telegram was brief. "Fire every one of them, Vance Harlow, and every man who stood by and let injustice happen, effective immediately. Signed, Silas Oaks McCade." He paid the fee and walked out into the bright afternoon sun, his heart hammering. For a moment, there was a fierce satisfaction. Then it drained away, leaving a hollow ache. He thought of old Pete, who had no family and would be destitute without his cook's pay. He thought of Billy, who had only followed orders because he was afraid of losing his first job. He thought of the other hands who had families, who had stayed silent not out of malice, but out of fear. By the time he reached the boarding house, his mind was racing. Ruthie sat on the steps, playing with the wooden horse, and she looked up with a smile that cut through his turmoil. "Did you send the message, Pa?" she asked. "I did, sweetheart." He sat down beside her and told her, as simply as he could, that the ranch was his now, left by great Uncle Leland. He told her he had asked Mr. Farnsworth to let go of the men who had been cruel. But even as he spoke, the words felt wrong. Ruthie listened, her brow furrowed, then said, "Pa, if you're the boss now, you can make it better. Can't you? Like you said, we'd find a place where people are fair." He looked into her earnest face and felt the knot in his chest loosen. "I want to, Sugar Plum, I surely do, but I reckon I started off on the wrong foot. Revenge isn't going to build that kind of place." That night, Silas hardly slept. He sat by the window, watching the moon trace its path, and by dawn, he had made his decision. He went back to the telegraph office as soon as it opened and sent a second message. Belay previous. Dismiss only Harlow and his direct accomplices. Retain all others at full wages, plus a share in the herd's increase. I intend to rebuild this ranch as a place where every man has a stake. Await your confirmation. The clerk raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. Fingers clacking the key. The reply came within the hour. "You are the owner. Act as your conscience dictates. I stand with you." Silas hired a buggy and a pair of good horses, and with Ruthie beside him, he drove back to the Lazy S. They arrived in the late afternoon, the ranch yard strangely quiet. The men were gathered near the bunkhouse, their belongings piled on the ground, faces dull with shock. Old Pete sat on an upturned bucket, his apron still on, tears tracing tracks through the dust on his cheeks. Billy stood with his hat in his hands, looking lost. Vance Harlow and two of his cronies were already gone, having left in a fury when the telegram from Farnsworth arrived, their authority stripped. The remaining hands had been told they were all out of work. Silas stepped down from the buggy, lifted Ruthie, and walked into the center of the yard. Every eye turned toward him. He took a breath that tasted of sage and cattle and home. "My name is Silas Oaks McCade," he said, his voice carrying across the stillness. "This ranch belonged to my uncle. It's mine now, but I didn't come to lord it over anyone. I came to say I was wrong to let anger speak for me. I fired you all in a moment of hurt, and that was unjust, so I'm asking you to stay." He looked at old Pete, at Billy, at the grizzled cowboys who had worked beside him for years. "I'm offering every man a fair wage and a share in the profits, a real stake. I want to build a place where nobody has to be afraid, where children are welcome, and where we all rise together. What say you?" There was a moment of profound silence. Then old Pete let out a sob that was half laugh, half relief, and got to his feet. "I thought I'd be burying my old bones in a pauper's grave," he said. "You bet I'll stay." Billy whooped, and the others began to grin, voices rising in a jumble of questions and approval. Ruthie tugged Silas's hand and whispered, "See, Pa? You just had to ask." He knelt and hugged her right there in the dust, and the men gathered round, some wiping their eyes, others clapping him on the shoulder. It was the second great welling of emotion, the kind that heals old wounds and plants new seeds. The days that followed were hard and hopeful. Silas sent word to Cheyenne for a builder, and by summer's end, a proper schoolhouse stood on the ranch, with a teacher hired from town. New contracts were drawn up, and the hands, 23 men now, signed them with a sense of ownership they had never known. Silas himself took no more pay than the average hand, pouring the ranch's profits back into better stock and a central cookhouse where everyone ate together. Ruthie grew brown and strong, learning her letters and helping old Pete in the kitchen garden. The Lazy S brand was registered with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and Silas attended a meeting at the Cheyenne Club, standing quietly among the cattle barons, his plain wool coat marking him as different. He didn't care. He had what he needed. A year later, on a warm June evening in 1885, Silas and Ruthie stood on a rise overlooking the herd. The cattle spread across the basin like dark ships on a grassy sea, calves bawling, the light turning the hills to gold. Ruthie had grown taller. She held the wooden horse in one hand, a habit now. She looked up at her father. "Pa, do you think Ma can see us?" she asked. Silas put his arm around her, feeling the weight of the world settle into something gentle. "I reckon she can, sweetheart. I reckon she's smiling down on this place, seeing how far we've come." She leaned into him. "This is home now, isn't it? Real home." "Yes, little bird," he said, his voice thick. "This is home." And they stood together as the sun slipped below the rim of the world, the prairie wind singing through the grass, and all around them the ranch hummed with the quiet, sturdy music of a new beginning. Thank you for sharing this journey with Silas and Ruthie. If their story touched your heart, we hope you'll subscribe to our channel for more tales of the Old West, where love and courage always find a way. Until next time, may your home be filled with warmth and your heart with kindness.